From New Hampshire Public Radio and the Howe Library in Hanover, New Hampshire, you're listening to Check This Out, a new literary series where we dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. I'm your host, Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna, and I am thrilled to be able to share these conversations with you over the next few weeks. Tania James is an associate professor of English at George Mason University who has published several novels and short stories. She's a first-generation Indian American, and her latest novel, Loot, was longlisted for the National Book Award. I had the pleasure of speaking to her before the nomination, before all the hoopla around this incredible novel. Buckle up. She's about to give us a front-row seat to 18th and 19th century imperialism, as seen through the eyes of an artisan, a toy maker, who begins his journey in 1794 in Mysore, India. Tania, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you, Rachel. It's totally my pleasure.
This novel, Loot, this gorgeous book, takes us to 1794, Mysore, India. And you bring us the story of Abbas, who starts as a woodworker. He loves making toys, but he's stuck in his father's workshop making furniture. He's plucked out of there to become an apprentice to a French clockmaker, Monsieur Deleuze. And what we see from there is basically his world opens up, right? He starts to build this tiger, this automaton for Tipu Sultan. And we get just to this amazing story. He opens up to a larger world, to the larger palace, to the city, to the continent, right? He travels to France. We see history. We see the horrors of colonialism. We see love. But what I really love about this book and why I couldn't put it down is because you tell us all of this on a very personal level. You bring the larger history book to Abbas himself and this big question of what does it mean to leave a mark? What is art? What is history? And it's one thing to read about colonialism and art in a history book, but to read about it in a story where I'm cheering for a character, where I'm crying for a character, right? This is beautiful. It brings it to life for me, and it's why I loved this book. So thank you so much. I wanted to start off by asking you to set the scene for us and tell us about this moment in history when we start the book. We're in 1794, Mysore, India. What are we looking at? Where are we?
This is a really, well, first of all, thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm so moved by how much you were moved. So to set up the novel a little bit, this moment in time, it starts in 1792, roughly. And it was, to me, a really interesting moment in the history of British Empire and colonialism, because it was really this hinge moment where at this point, the British East India Company only controlled about 9% of India, and then mainly in the north and the east, so only 9% of territory. But they really were hell bent on getting control of the south, which is Mysore Kingdom is in the south, and so they were the only forces that were really standing in their way were the Marathas, and then Tipu and Hyder Ali's Mysore Kingdom. And so it's sort of this moment where until now, the East India Company has been sort of like a trading company, but then after this moment, they really turn into the aggressive, on the road to becoming the aggressive superpower they were going to become. And so I didn't realize that when I started writing the novel, but the more I researched, I thought, oh, wow, this is actually, we learned so little about it. Well, I learned very little about it when I was a student of history or learning social studies and the history of colonialism in high school. But it was a crucial turning point for the world, really.
Tania, I love that you're dropping us into this turning point, this tipping point in India, where we're going from a sort of gentle colonialism, if there is such a thing, right, to this harsher moment of war. And I thought you laid that out really well. If you could just read this section for us, please, that starts Tipu's kingdom.
Tipu's kingdom barely survived the most recent war with the English, and talk of still another is always on the horizon. The people never know who is coming from where to take what from whom. All they can do is submit to power each time it changes hands, each time the powerful decide to redecorate. This one wants a new calendar, that one wants his face struck on a coin. With every alteration, large and small, the ground unfirms itself beneath their feet, making it nearly impossible for anyone to leave a lasting mark. At the moment, Abbas has no interest in leaving a mark. All he wants is to stay out of trouble, though it is, perhaps, a little late for that.
I love that section because we're right in the beginning of the book, and already you are introducing us to this idea of leaving a mark. And I thought for me, that was really one of the overall themes. The most important part is this question of how do we leave a mark? And you introduce us to Abbas, who has no interest in leaving a mark because he's a young kid. He's a teenager at this point making toys. So can you tell us about Abbas?
Yeah, Abbas is from a family of woodworkers, so probably somewhat lower class, a Muslim family, and everyone has been doing the same work for generations. But he has that sort of artistic spirit. I think that one trait I think of as being common to most artists, which is curiosity and a kind of inability to sort of fall in line in terms of what he's supposed to make. And so he starts making toys. He's always been carving figurines and toys, and these things, for better or worse, get the attention of Tipu Sultan. And so at first he sees this, his family sees this as a liability, but then it sort of becomes obvious to him that there's somewhere he can go with his toys and his creations, that there's more he could be and more he could do. And he sees that in his mentor, the person who will become his mentor, Lucien Dulez, who is a French clockmaker at the court of Tipu Sultan, but he also makes automata, or these automatons, if you don't know, are these, for people who don't know, were precursors to robots, basically. They were, these mechanized humans or creatures or things that were made to resemble human movement. And so he's just really dazzled by that. And he just sort of comes into this awareness of himself as an artist. And also, I think much of what drives him is that desire, as you said, to leave a mark, to leave something of himself behind, which was, this question of erasure was something I kept thinking about as I was researching and as I was writing.
Yeah. So, but I want to stick just for a minute here with this idea of his hobby is toys, right? And his parents and his mom wants him to be a scribe eventually, right? And his dad wants him to focus on furniture, but he's whittling toys all the time. And toys are sort of disarming. You think of kids, right? Little kids playing with toys. But here they are his ticket out, in a sense, right? And there's sort of a dark side to his toys. So why did you choose toys?
Well, there was a practical reason, which was when I was first researching this area. There's actually Tipu Sultan, the ruler of Mysore, had brought toy makers from, I think it was Iran, but this kind of group of toy makers, because he was really charmed by these toys. And so there's a long history of toy makers in Mysore, mainly based in Channapatna, the small village. And they've been there for hundreds of years, and they make these incredibly just whimsical, beautiful, bright wooden toys. They're all wooden, and the dyes are natural. And I just remember watching videos of these toys, and there's a way in which when you watch a toy being made, or you see a toy using a toy on your own, it just turns you into a child, and it kind of unlocks a sort of wonder that I think as an adult is harder and harder to access. But that just seemed to me immediately, it was an object that was immediately emotional because of what it does to the person who's using it. And I just loved the whimsy was another thing I was after with this novel. Like I wanted people to be delighted by what they're reading, even as we're carrying sort of heavy subjects here with colonialism and war and migration. I wanted the whimsy of the novel to be a counterpoint to those things, and toys just immediately, kind of moving toys, hand crank toys, all of that felt like, a way to sort of balance that seriousness.
So Abbas becomes an apprentice to Monsieur Dulez, and he is called in to make this tiger, this famous tiger. So tell us about the tiger.
So this is a real-life automaton that is currently in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. It's a 6-foot-long wooden tiger that is mauling the throat of a prone English soldier, and his when you turned a hand crank back in the day when it worked. The tiger would grunt and the soldier would sort of groan. and there's like there was an organ inside the tiger, and there would be organ music in the background, and so it was a real thing that he commissioned, and as you can probably tell, it really encapsulated how much he hated the British East India Company. I mean, he had British people at the court actually, different kinds of engineers and things, but as an entity, he hated the British East India Company, and that really kind of encapsulated that contempt. But also, I just thought when I saw it, it's actually kind of funny, and it's kind of, there's a sort of there's a kind of irreverence to it and absurdity to it as well. So all of those things, I just loved the spirit of this object, and it just kept like, I just kept thinking about it. And I've since talked to other kind of colonial scholars, and nobody can think of like people are like, that's kind of the only art object they can think of that is made by the colonial subject with that kind of humor and kind of sinister quality to it. And so I just think it's kind of exceptional for its time. I mean, there probably were other things like it, but this is what we have left.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Tania James, and you're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Tania's new novel, Loot. Let's talk a little bit more about this tiger. There is an amazing description that you give about it. There's, I guess, a smaller version of it that Jeanne has, a character that we'll talk about in just a minute. And she describes it as painted in juvenile colors, yet mature in subject, such that she felt herself maturing as she pondered the agony of the man fated to lie forever between death and life, betwixt platform and predator, a predator that was both frightening and alluring. She wished to intervene, but the carving was all of a piece and denied intervention. I love that description because, again, you have this disarming idea that it's a toy, and yet it is brutal. This tiger, right? It literally has his teeth in the British soldier's neck.
Mm-hmm. I thank you for reading that section. It had me thinking about what inspired it. I was thinking about there's this little miniature statue in my parents' house, and it's of two kind of tiger cubs kind of on top of two tigers taking down an elephant. And I used to stare at that thing and just couldn't figure out who I felt more for, because I thought these are tiger cubs, but it's also, I feel for the elephant, and these were little ways in which I was constantly trying to find connections between myself and the characters, who biographically are very far from my own experience. And the only way I could do it was by kind of layering my own memories and trying to access a specific kind of emotion and a specific kind of contemplation and sort of giving it to a character. So I had forgotten about that passage, but yeah, it takes me back to my own childhood, actually.
I mean, this is really where I'm talking about how you access history through the eyes of a boss in this book so effectively, because we are pulled into the story, but actually there is the history here, right? And so the next time we see the tiger after, the first sort of foray into the world when it's introduced, we see it at the siege after Tipu Sultan is killed. And I thought it was a horrific scene where the soldiers, the mercenaries, everyone who has been employed or forced to fight against Tipu, right, line up, and they are basically told you can now each have something from his treasures, right, and like basically line up and take something here. And we see the tiger again. So can you tell us about this moment and introduce us to Colonel Selwyn?
This was a moment. So there were 4 wars that Tipu Sultan fought against the British, and this was the final war, which actually was barely a war. It was done in like several hours, maybe half a day, where the British basically came through and destroyed the capital city and killed thousands and thousands of people. And what followed in the days after, it was just a mass kind of looting of everything, books, objects, art objects, also, massive levels of sexual assault, just looting and plundering in every possible way. And at some point, the general, I think General Harris, one of the generals, had to kind of put a stop to it. So he had several of his own men executed, and then they set up this sort of system, this committee, and they had tables and where people were coming up and saying, requesting this and requesting that, and assessing their rank, and therefore basing what you get on what your rank or what you did in the siege, I guess. But I just thought it was this idea. I think there's a line in the novel that says, "Plunder is chaos, prize is organized," and I just thought it was a really kind of absurd idea that if we just organize it, if we just organize ourselves, and if everybody lines up, then it's somehow legal and fine. And so I just thought I'll lean into the absurdity here a little bit, and I wrote a scene about just these people standing in line. And one of the people standing in line is a guy named Colonel Horace Selwyn, who has fought in the wars, and he's standing there and trying to figure out what his wife would like the best. And most people wanted the jewels, which they would like kind of take and reset into some other necklace or something. And his wife is somebody very different from other people. She's into romance, and she's into the Orient, quote unquote, and she sort of has this like taste for Orientalist art. And so when he sets his eyes on Tipu's tiger, the automaton, he knows that even though it's just wood and glue, it doesn't have inherent value the way jewels do. He knows that's what his wife will want. And so he gets this object, and that's how the object, Tipu's tiger, makes its way to England. In real life, the object was taken back to England, but it wasn't in private hands. It was taken to the India House, which was a kind of, I think, not quite a museum, but it was a public space. But yeah, so this was the way in which I thought, I'm going to get this object across the ocean. I'm going to give it to this one character.
But the scene, right, you set it up. I mean, so imagine these soldiers, these men are in line waiting for their treasure, and they're literally dead bodies all around, right? The smell is horrific. You describe it so, perfectly, I thought. There's blood everywhere, and they're like pushing and elbowing to get a ruby, right, or this tiger. I mean, talk about the horrors of war and colonialism. You just encapsulated it right there. And also, the brutality against women. And you wrote it with this spare, haunting prose. And I just wanted to read one of my favorite of your few sentences in here about it. You wrote, "Of the women, some scream and some don't. Some proffer jewels in exchange for immunity. One for whom it's too late to proffer anything staggers around a corner, clutching the torn drawstring of her skirt. Know that she will survive this night and many to come. What will sustain her is the story that will form in her mind, in which she is not the spoils of war, but a fallen warrior." So powerful, because in just a few sentences, I think you've created the scene, the chaos, and the horrors. And I cried when I read that. I just thought it was really powerful in so few sentences. Um, So I wanted to ask you about how you did some of the research to really come to these details and find out a little bit more about, the moment of the siege and what was happening, versus how much you had to imagine was going on just in this one scene.
I don't think I ever found any account of that siege that was from the perspective of anyone on the losing side, so no one from the Mysore side. It was all accounts of British soldiers or people on the British East India Company side who had been through it, and so therefore it was sort of a very bird's eye view of things, and also like kind of written in the aftermath. So there were just few like small details that I seized on, and one that I loved was that as Tipu was dying, or maybe right after he died, someone snipped off a corner of his mustache. And, the sort of superior officer who saw this was really appalled. But the officer who did that, the soldier who did that, was like, well, everyone's doing it. And how that one little piece of mustache attained value and becomes a sort of iconic kind of representation of this legendary tyrant. And this, there were just kind of very small details like that. But in terms of one of the things I did do eventually, because of the pandemic, I couldn't actually go to Mysore when I wanted to go. And so I did all of my research in books. And then finally, I did go to Mysore. I did kind of visit these places. They have a marker where he fell, where Tipu Sultan fell. And it just, I think the what that gave me was a sort of sense of how small how small these spaces are where people are fighting, and how in my mind somehow, maybe because of war movies, I just think of these big battles as being huge landscapes, but these are sort of very kind of tighter spaces, and somehow that made it even more haunting. And also that I was paying attention to the sort of trees that were around, and kind of the only things who probably are still alive and were witness to these kind of this bloodshed. But I really had to kind of imagine my way into this space, because I didn't have a whole lot to go on in terms of what I could get a hold of with my reading.
So interesting, not surprising that mostly the only history that you had to go on was written by the British. We are going to talk more about the sources of history and how we record and who we record history when we come back. I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out on NHPR. We're going to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment with my guest, Tania James. We're talking about her new amazing novel, Loot. Stay with us. I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out on NHPR. I'm here with my guest, Tania James. We're talking about her new novel, Loot. I want to dive into this question of history, who writes history, who decides what is history, because we were just talking about the siege of Tipu Sultan's last fort, right, and the end of that war in Mysore, India. And you noted that the sources that you had are primarily British. And in the book, you give an account of this battle several different times, in artwork in different ways. And we see history changing versus what Abbas, the main character, actually saw. And so this question of who decides what is history is very haunting, and you bring that to life. So can you talk a little bit about that and how you thought about it as you were writing this book?
Well, at first I was a little bit intimidated by the lack of historical records there are historical records, but the perspectives I wanted, I couldn't find. And so at first I thought maybe this isn't the right subject for me, because I just associated historical fiction with like highly meticulously researched works, like people who are like Hilary Mantel, who I love, Jim Shepard, Andrea Barrett. These are people who really spend so much time on research. And I just thought, how am I going to gain the authority to write about these things? But then I just kept being drawn to this material anyway, and I just sort of liberated myself from this idea that history has to be kind of so rooted in fact, and instead trying to hew towards the emotional truth of these characters. I found it really helpful to think about it after I listened to an interview with the poet and writer, fiction writer, Ocean Vuong, and he was describing a poem that he had written about Saigon, or the fall of Saigon, and he said, "I'm not writing as a witness of history. I'm writing sort of like Homer writing 400 years after the Trojan War. I'm building a mythology out of the history I come from." And so I just thought that was a beautiful way to think about that. Historical fiction doesn't have to be rooted in facts and rooted in witness. It is a way you can think about it as a way of stepping into the void with your own imagination and sort of imagining other possibilities. And so that was basically I felt like that's what I'm doing. And so that gave me a lot of freedom in the way I was thinking about it too.
I love that. But of course, one of the reasons that I thought your book really, was so amazing and really drew me in so intensely was because not only are you asking what is history, but you are asking what is art. and how do we leave a mark, in particular in relation to Abbas, right, and him being an artist. So we pick up the story. Abbas is there at the siege of Tipu, right, and he is sort of knocked over. He spends 3 days unconscious, and then he staggers up and finds his way onto a ship. Right, and we are launched to the next portion here, and Abbas on the next portion of his life when he's at sea, he has this amazing quote. You write, "You must understand, I did not come through such misery in order to serve others. Now I serve myself." So take us through, where is Abbas? Right, he's after this battle, he's survived, he's getting on the boat. What's happening?
He sort of miraculously gets to go on an East India Company ship as the assistant to the carpenter. So he has basically been hanging around these dockyards and just trying to convince someone to let him get on the ship, because basically he has this idea that if he goes to England and if he can just find his former mentor, the clockmaker, Monsieur Dulez will, as Dulez had promised, Dulez will mentor him and apprentice him so that Abbas himself can also become a maker of automatons, and which is what he wants to do. And so this is how he sort of gets aboard the ship, which is, I at first I had such a hard time trying to imagine how a kid of such humble beginnings would, find his way across the ocean. But I think it helped me to think about this novel, as a kind of picaresque, where a character is just going from one adventure to the next. And I think also, what's driving him is, as you said, this intensity of desire, intensity of ambition. And I think maybe part of that is driven by when you see your home burn behind you, and you feel like there's nothing to go back to. Perhaps there's all the more reason to kind of, rush forward into the unknown.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Tania James, and you're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about the new novel, Loot. Okay, so we have this character, Abbas. He's arrived in France, and he's found this childhood friend / crush, right, Jean, and they are reunited. And miraculously, they find out that they know where this tiger is, Tipu's tiger is, that Abbas had made all those years ago. And so then they start out on this quest to find it again, and Lady Selwyn has it. So how did you think about this part of the quest, right, and finding this tiger? Why include this part?
Well, actually, when I first was thinking about this novel, I had only conceived of it as a heist novel that takes place in an English country house. Those two things really intrigued me. I really enjoy an English country house novel, and I thought, why can't I do that? And I also really enjoy a heist novel, so I thought there will be two characters who are going after this object that is owned by a wealthy English woman. But then, as I was sort of thinking about this, the more I tried to think about these characters, I kept thinking about what would drive two people to risk their reputation, their life on getting this one object. And that's how I sort of thought about, well, it must have certain significance for the artist himself or themselves. And I kept that is what had me kind of moving backwards in time and going all the way to the beginning of how he even got this job in the first place. But this third part of the novel is really where it started conceptually for me.
I love that. It started out as a heist. I love it. All right, because they do get there and they're thinking, maybe we'll steal it. Maybe we can bargain for it. Maybe we can, there are different ways we can do this. So they encounter Lady Selwyn and they encounter Rum. So tell us about Rum.
So Rum is a steward to Lady Selwyn, like he's sort of her right-hand man in business. And he actually served her husband in India. But her husband was the one who was standing at the prize committee and got her that Tipu's tiger. But he dies pretty soon after that, and so Rum, in a certain way, he kind of replaces Colonel Selwyn. He brings the tiger to her. He kind of nurses her through her depression and her grief, and ends up being the person she trusts the most in work and in personal life. And so he's very, very protective of her. And he is very, very suspicious of these two people who have come. It's basically Abbas and Jean, who have come with several objects they want to trade, and sort of they're trying to insinuate themselves into her life in an attempt to kind of swindle the Tipu's tiger out of her possession.
But and he asks at some point, are you an artist or a con artist?
Yeah,
So what is the
he
difference?
kind of gets all the good lines. I feel like he kind of. Yeah, I felt like his voice was really fun to write because it's that suspicion and cynicism and kind of cheekiness. I feel like he gets some good jabs in there.
But also this question of what is art comes up again, right? What is art? I felt like that's what he was really asking. And he catches Abbas as he sneaks in to see the tiger. And Abbas is looking for his signature and Monsieur Dulez's signature. And again, we get to this big theme that you know I love. How do you leave your mark? So can we talk about that signature?
I mean, I thought about this a lot, like how to me, this desire to leave a mark is I personally don't have that. I don't have, and it might be I'm a product of the time in which I live, and it's, we forget about things that happened, 2 days ago. I can't, it's just news cycles through so quickly. I was thinking about how that desire, though, you do want to make a thing. As an artist, it is an aspirational thing to make a thing that lasts. But sometimes when I'm looking at a painting, I almost feel like you can see signs of the artist in the work that are far more personal to me than the signature itself or knowing this person's name. So like if you're looking at a painting that has like a little kind of like a little bit of paint that's dabbed in a way that you can see the texture. Or when you see the cut in Tipu's Tiger, you can kind of see the cut that's made that sort of is maybe a little imperfect or something. Those kind of things to me feel to me as personal as the signature itself. And so I don't know. I was thinking names too, though. Names, I just feel like there's something very human about wanting to be remembered and wanting your name to be remembered. And there's so many kind of works of art where, I was looking at a Turkish rug the other day and I could see the woman had stitched her name into the corner. I find that really beautiful and kind of mysterious and sort of universal, that desire to be remembered.
Yeah. But what was fascinating was that nobody had noticed the names. They were so well hidden in the tiger. And then it's later on, Rum decides when this tiger is eventually taken to a museum, right? The person who donates it, the man who eventually inherited it and had nothing to do with the making or anything else, right? You see a plaque for him and his generosity in the museum. And it's Rum who decides to put the names of the artists on there in the end. So can you talk about that too? I mean, right? Who gets their name on that plaque in the museum?
Yeah, and it's just to me kind of interesting in that moment. It just comes down to one person's choice. I and it's I think about the way not only like the names that are presented, but also the kind of information that's on the placard, the way in which these things are framed. Like, Tipu's Tiger is in the V&A Museum, and it's sort of sitting alongside other things that were, taken from the siege, like Tipu's robe and Tipu's gun. And so then with that context, we think of it as a sort of artifact of the siege. But do we think of it as a work of art? I'm not sure. I think, what if it was, displayed next to other, works of art or art objects or wood carvings, and how does that change the conversation? And how does that change the way we're looking at this object? Not just like a kind of ethnographic artifact, but like as an actual work of art. And so I think that putting someone's name there does kind of add to that idea that this was someone's masterpiece, or this was someone's, the product of someone's imagination. And And I think,
Right? I
yeah,
mean, I kept thinking, what if we put this next to like a Matisse, right? Or a Chagall, something that is this accepted, European, narrative of what is beautiful art. If we put this tiger there, how differently would we look at it?
that's really what it's all about to me. The way in which these small choices kind of reframe the way we're thinking about the object itself and the people who made it.
Yeah. All right, we're going to be right back because I have a million more questions for you, Tanya. I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out on NHPR. We're going to take a short break. I will be back very soon with my guest, Tania James, and we are talking about her new novel, Loot. Welcome back. I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out on NHPR. My guest today is Tania James, and we are talking about her new novel, Loot. Tanya, I want to go back into this question of what is art, what is knowledge. And one of my favorite themes and ideas that you touch on here is the automaton. And I thought that some of the themes here, one of the reasons why this book works so well is because we are not just stuck in Mysore, India, right? And the thinking back then in the 1790s, they are actually very relevant and very modern. And we have Tipu Sultan himself, who is saying, right now in Europe, automata are being constructed to do things beyond your wildest dreams. There's one automaton in the form of a Turk, seated before a chessboard, able to win against any human opponent that challenges him. There's another automaton from the past century, a duck that could both eat from the ground and then digest and excrete exactly as a duck in flesh. So talk about that connection to AI today.
Mm. Well, that you're reading that has me thinking about the way in which um, I think the most disturbing thing about AI is the way in which tech, there's this kind of race to kind of compete and to kind of, disregarding the harm that, AI can do. Just this, we have to be first. We just have to do it. Our hands are tied because we can't have a kind of moral consciousness about this because we have to get ahead of everybody else. And so I just listening to you read about Tipu, he was really a visionary in terms of no understanding how technology was going to be the thing that allows Mysore to compete, and India really to compete on the world stage, and to prevent Mysore from being swallowed up into other colonial powers. But there's something about that competitive aspect of it that has me thinking about the way in which we talk about AI these days, and the way in which development seems to just be getting away from us purely because out of ego, I guess.
But also, AI, we see these advancements in small places where we don't even recognize maybe it's there. And here you cloak them in the guise of toys, right? And we see this so that it's sort of sneaking up on us. And I thought that that is what we see happening today as well. So, I wanted to know if you could talk about how you thought about that, right? Were you directly thinking about today's AI and how it's sort of hidden, slowly coming up?
I really wasn't thinking about it. It's only been in interviews that had sort of come up because started writing this novel so long ago, and the AI conversation was probably around, but not the way it is today. I did think a lot about mechanization and how the fear that automatons might replace, craftsmen and artisans. I think that fear was actually legitimate. It was very, based in reality. There were there were people developing automatons at the time to replace weavers, or, which was, there was a lot of fear and a lot of alarm about it. And that felt to me very present. And it feels to me now like a conversation we have every so often, where it's just this fear of humans being replaced. That was common then, and as it is common now.
So you mentioned that you started this novel so long ago. When did you start it?
I think I started it in 2011. I want to say 2018. At least I started thinking about it in 2018.
I think so many people think books all of a sudden just come out of writers.
Right. I wish. Yeah.
It's a long, long process. So I wanted to ask you, how personal is this novel?
I think I feel like the aspects of the artist are very personal to me. The development of Abbas, how he comes into an understanding of what he wants to be and what he wants to do. I am not nearly as ambitious as he is, but I think I probably was when I was his age, so in my 20s maybe. I just remember that that hunger, that desire to make and to do and to learn. And I also, understand that through his relationship with his mentor, how much he needs that mentor. And I don't think I had a mentor in that way that was so kind of huge in my life, but I remember looking at people who were kind of mentors to me and who were farther ahead than me, and just kind of just this, adoration of what they were doing, but also this like almost like a not a almost like a greed, like I want what you have. I think he's thinking that Abbas at one point in the
Isn't that a
novel.
line in the book? I
Yes,
want what you have.
yes, yes.
Yes.
That felt very personal to me. Like I could remember that feeling of like, I wish, I could have what you have. But of course, you don't understand at that point that that desire, you never actually reach the, as an artist, you never actually reach that moment of like, I have it, I got it, I don't need anything else. I mean, maybe you do, and I haven't gotten there yet. But it's sort of that sense of always wanting that, at least for me, makes me want to make something else. So, yeah.
And how about bringing the history of this time, the colonialism, right? The story from Mysore. How personal was that to you, too?
Well, it's personal in the sense that it's part of my history, but I don't know that I don't know that I felt that personal about it. My parents were born in Kerala, which is a state that's near Karnataka and Mysore, but not. I think there was times in my research where I was reading where Tipu Sultan was having confrontations with kingdoms in Kerala. I think that what for me it was somewhat personal because they were, my own family members were telling me about their own kind of feelings about Tipu, which weren't entirely positive because of this, history, from 200 years ago. They still can cite that. But I think for me, I didn't feel personal. I didn't feel like, yeah, I wouldn't say it was personal for me, but it was just my personal interests were more thematic than, situational.
Yeah. So I also wanted to ask you about the history that you've included in here. We touched very briefly on this idea that you're really building a mythology, and there were big holes, right, in some of the historical records that you got to fill in with fiction, because this is fiction at the end of the day. Um, how much did you allow yourself leeway? Like, sort of how lenient were you with yourself versus really looking for every little historical fact and detail? Sort of how did you think about that balance while writing this book?
Well, I thought so. All the major kind of historical events, I wanted to stick to the exact timings. I wanted to stick as closely as possible to those things. They felt to me like tent poles that I needed in order to be able to play. I needed some kind of border to set around myself, some kind of boundary, and then I can play within those boundaries. And the characters themselves, I was able to that was more where my imagination was coming from. And with, Tipu Sultan, I didn't have a whole lot of information about him. I had, biographies that were written, much later after he died. And actually the one thing I had was this really interesting book called The Dream Journal of Tipu Sultan, or The Dream Register, where he was recording his dreams. And that to me was a really kind of way for me to play with this character, who was a real character. And I just had to think of him as a completely different character from the person who existed. I never felt like I need to be true to, our conception of who this character is, which is different from, fictionalizing a character like Abraham Lincoln, where you have so many speeches and so many records about him. So the again, like the lack of, speeches and records about what Tipu Sultan was really like was kind of helpful for me in conceptualizing a character who is a sort of maybe a more extreme version, and a kind of more comic version than the person who existed.
Yeah. So before we switch gears into me asking you more about like the writing process, right? Because I have a lot of listeners who like to know about, right, how to become an author type questions and that kind of thing. There's one big question that I really want to ask you about. And it's this phrase, you talk about it, you use it a few times in the book, you talk about it in the author's note at the end, and you write, "We are here because you were there." And I love that phrase because it makes me immediately think about this question, what are you? Right, which I think is coming up more and more often. People are saying, "Why do you need to know? I am human. What are you? I am human." Right? Why are you writing this story? Like, right? And sort of what is Abbas doing in France? You would get that question, and I love this answer. We are here because you were there. Can you talk about that phrase and that theme in the book?
Yeah, that line is actually from, I think, from a Sri Lankan writer and activist, British Sri Lankan. His name is, I want to say S. Amalavner, I think. I love this idea. I love the idea of putting that directly in the novel. I thought of doing it as an epigraph, but I just think the story of colonialism, we think of it as being finished. We think of colonialism, at least I'd always thought of colonialism, specifically the Indian side of that story, to be done in 1947 at partition. But the story of colonialism, at least the effects, if you think of the effects of colonialism, are ongoing, particularly because of migration. And colonialism is responsible for the mass, migrations all over the world of South Asians being in. I mean, I can't think of a place where we are not. So I loved this idea of the novel, which is historical and taking place in the past, speaking to our present. And I love historical fiction that does that, where it is a product of its time, but it's also a product of the contemporary moment.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Tania James, and you're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Tania's new novel, Loot. All right, Tania, we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I want to ask you more of the writerly questions, as I like to call them. So, you are a professor in an MFA program. Could you tell us about your role there?
Sure. I'm an associate professor at George Mason University's MFA program. Yeah, I've been there for about 7 years.
Wow, so you can talk to us about the writing process as a professor and as a published author. So I know my listeners are going to have all kinds of questions on this front. A lot of people who listen to the show are writers, aspiring writers, and they want to know. So talk to me about the process with your editor a little bit and the fact checking. How careful were facts checked for this book?
I'm sure they were very well checked. I I love the process of I love the kind of production process. It's just so gratifying and very humbling to know how many people are spending time on your work and trying to get it to finished form. And I'm sure I don't actually realize how many people are working on it or putting eyes on it and putting their time on it, but I'm into it. My process with my editor, we've been together. This is our fourth book together. And she's, wonderful in many ways, but one of the biggest ways I find she's so instructive in terms of structure and in terms of momentum and urgency. And this is something I talk to my students about, this question of urgency. But, saying it is much easier than doing it and realizing where you're losing, these things. And just also,
Urgency in the narrative.
yeah, and just also being aware of, well, if I just being intentional about those choices and where the momentum is slowing, is that what I want? And if that's what I want, what am I giving the reader in place of that? And because that's just something I enjoy as a writer and oftentimes as a reader, I like a book that moves, and that is aware of and intentional about its sort of movement. And so, my editor, Jordan Pavlin, was asked a lot of questions about. Sometimes I would move into a different point of view, and she would just question when I was doing that. Am I sure about taking the attention away from Abbas at this moment, or taking attention away from the central kind of sort of through line at this moment? And it was
I was
helpful.
just
Yeah.
I was just about to ask you about point of views because you have so many point of views in here and it works beautifully. So how much did you go back and forth about on POVs, point of views with your editor?
I think the really just go back and forth once because she's just questioning and making sure that's what I want, and if it is, then fine. And that's she's very kind of she's sort of respectful about that making it be the book that I want it to be, but I did take her advice toward the end where there was, for example, there's a smaller character named Middle John, and I wrote this sort of 2 to 3 page kind of like memories and food memory to do with a pear tree, and I just was so attached to it, but I completely saw what she was saying, that it was at this point when the novel is sort of funneling towards something, it was taking away from that funneling and sort of kind of sending the reader down a different path. And there were multiple things like that where she was suggesting streamlining, and there were some that I pushed back on, and specifically to do with Lady Selwyn, because I really just had so much fun writing that character, and I found myself surprised by how much I came to care for her and be interested in her, even as she was sometimes saying and doing toxic things or disturbing things.
Love that. So what advice do you have for new writers or aspiring writers?
Well, I feel like this is again advice that I have to remind myself of and try to think about, which is to pay attention to what you pay attention to. Because I think sometimes we can the noise around what other people are writing, what is popular, what is trending, can be deafening, and all you really have is your unique kind of idiosyncratic perspective. Like, your obsessions are not going to be the same as my obsessions, but it's your enthusiasm for your subject and your passion for your subject that will kind of define the work. And so that's my main thing, is just kind of pay attention to your own, pay attention to what you're paying attention to.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. You're listening to Check This Out on NHPR. My guest today is Tania James, and we are talking about her new novel, Loot. And right now we are getting some advice for new writers, aspiring writers. So can you talk about process? Do you have advice for how you actually write a novel?
Well, my own process is very kind of methodical. And so sometimes that's good. And sometimes, I think it's helpful for me to just be like, this is my goal in terms of the number of words I'm going to do a day, and to sort of
Could you
be,
be specific? Because people love to be
yeah. I
specific.
mean, I have a sort of, it's not a spreadsheet, but I have a kind of chart, and I write like the number of words that I did that day, and what I actually worked on, and what I'm going to work on tomorrow, because I think that's another thing for me. Like, I somehow have a goldfish memory these days, and I cannot remember what I ate for breakfast yesterday. So I have to be very specific about what is the possibility for tomorrow. And that just kind of doesn't waste time in the morning. I also start with reading. I always start with something that seems to share some kinship in terms of tone or something with what I'm working on before I start writing. And then I feel like the other thing that I want to do more of, that has always helped me, is walking and getting away from the computer and working in the notebook rather than the screen. But those are kind of the ways I move through the process.
And for people who come to you and say, should I get an MFA? Should I apply for an MFA? How do you answer that?
I would say that I think that, first of all, I advise them that if you're going to apply, go to places that are going to fully fund you. And I also think it's just such a big question. I mean, I think what I can say is what the MFA gave me was not necessarily learning how to write, but learning how to talk about writing, and how to talk about other books that I love, but I didn't have the grammar to understand why, and what I am starting to do well. But really, I think that is so important, because after you leave, reading is going to be so much of so much of what instructs you in terms of your taste and what you like and why you like it. And so kind of identifying the language and the way to talk about these things it will help you, for years and years to come. But it doesn't have to come from an MFA program. So it just depends on your temperament and where you learn successfully.
And my last question for you is, you've seen a lot of students come through your classroom. What are some of the mistakes and some of the good choices that new writers are making as they are looking for agents and trying to get started?
I think one of the mistakes, which is a mistake that I made, and yet I turned out okay, but is impatience. And I say that with full understanding of what it's like to be out of an MFA program and seeing other people publish and, wanting to, be accredited in some way as a real writer, whatever that means. And, but I think there's a healthy kind of impatience. There's a healthy kind of like impatience that drives you to kind of do more. But I think there's an impatience that kind of is also limiting. And one of the mistakes I see too is when people kind of come in with a novel and that's their entire goal for the entire time they're there, is to just get that novel to be perfect. And I just think an MFA program should be about playing and experimenting and trying as much as you can try different things.
Thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you, and I look forward to staying in touch and reading a lot more in the future.
Thank you so much for the time and, just these wonderful questions. I really, really appreciate it.
You've been listening to Check This Out, a new literary series which is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the Howe Library in Hanover, New Hampshire. We dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. I'm Rachel Barenbaum, and I'll be back next week at this same time with more conversations. Our producers today are Jared Jenish, Megan Coleman, and NHPR's Emily Quirk. The Howe Library Director is Ruby Simon. NHPR's Program Director is Emily Quirk. The show is sponsored by the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation and the Howe Library Corporation. Thank you for listening. I'll see you next time.